I got slime on my mouth. In the 1850s, Italy, as we think of it today, wasn't a thing. I mean, boot was still there, but it was made up of a whole bunch of little micro countries and outside European presences. And so some guys got together around 1850 and said, hey, maybe we should do a thing where we fight some people or kill some people or something and have a unified Italy again. And this movement for Italian unification was called the Risorgimento.
Gorlami.
They try one unification war and it doesn't really work out, and they try a second one, and this time it's going almost too well. Because in the South, you've got this guy named Garibaldi, who's like a professional revolutionary, just travels the world revolutionizing things. And he got hired on to liberate Sicily, so he gets done doing that. Sicily's the soccer ball that the boot is kicking. Then he makes his way up to Naples. But there's a problem, because making his way down toward Naples is King Victor Emmanuel of Corsica and Piedmont. And he's had great success in the north, both politically and militarily. And now these two look like they're headed for a collision course, which stinks because they theoretically want the same thing. But we've seen this a billion times in history, right? It's about the people and the republic, but when it really comes down to it, it's about power. There's no way these two aren't going to get into a big brawl and murder each other. Here's the weird part. They both show up in Naples in 1860, and Garibaldi just rides up to Emmanuel and shakes his hand. And it's like, hey, bro, go Italy or whatnot, and he just gives him the southern half of Italy for free. It totally works out, and Italy is reunified, and they resorgiment, and everything is cool. Segue! Did I scare you? Tina jumped. In Acts chapter 18, you got two guys just like this on a collision course. You have Paul, who we know a lot about, on his way to Ephesus, where he's going to meet Apollos, who we're just meeting. Both of these guys have had a ton of success in different arenas doing the whole church gospel, Jesus thing, and now there's a lot at stake. If we put them in the same room and they have a big, stupid religious turf war, it's going to be a giant setback for the fledgling church. But if they can handle their business like those guys in Italy did, this is probably going to be a good thing for everybody. I'm going to talk about this passage in two parts. The first one is 18 through 23. I'm going to put it on the screen right now so you can pause it and read it. In the first part of this passage, Paul is saying goodbye to Corinth, where he spent a ton of time and put in a bunch of work. He's taken his friends Priscilla and Aquila with him, presumably to drop them off somewhere along the way. And there's this odd detail in here about getting a haircut. So it kind of makes me think that Paul had taken some kind of vow that involved maybe not cutting his hair, like maybe the Nazirite vow that Samson took back in the Old Testament. So this guy might have looked like a wild man tent maker while he was in Corinth, and now he's tidied up and looking all ready for travel and handsome and dapper with his little spring travel outfit on. And they make their way to Ephesus, which is a big, important town in the classical world. I did a video on that, so you can catch that if you want to understand more about the place. If you don't, I don't even care. Paul hangs out at the synagogue in Ephesus, and it looks like nothing of note really happens, and he leaves his buddies, gets on a boat, sails to Judea, where he checks in at Caesarea, and there's a Petrine church there. And Petrine is a word that insecure people use as an adjective to describe things associated with Peter's. It's a Peter church. It's a Peter church. I don't know why I didn't say it that way in the first place. After that, we can do a little Bible triangulation to figure out that Paul probably went south to check in at Jerusalem before making his way back up north to end his second missionary journey back where it started at the sending church in Antioch. The second half of this story is the potential conflict moment. We've got Apollos in Ephesus, and we've got Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus on behalf of Paul. So these two mentalities are both there, even though Paul isn't in town yet. We're going to see how that works out starting right now. Verse 24. Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He'd been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only about the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos wanted to go to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. On arriving, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted the Jews in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Right off the bat, we learn that Apollos is a Christian, but he's a Christian by way of John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist hasn't been on the scene for 25 years, and by not on the scene, I mean decapitated. But back when he was capitated, he was a really big deal for just a little bit of time right before Jesus. And he agreed with Jesus theologically. I mean, they were going for the same stuff. But John's ministry was way different than Jesus' ministry. John was a wild man, lived out in the desert, called people to radical spiritual change and repentance from their bad stuff. dunked him in water, presumably the Jordan River. And so people were having ultimate spiritual experiences, life-changing spiritual experiences with John the Baptist. And then Jesus came along. So there are a whole bunch of people who were able to have the luxury of following Jesus around, but John had a thing going. And there were a lot of people who really liked him and who followed John around as long as they could. So you've got the Christianity thing, and people know that the John the Baptist thing is associated with the Christianity thing, but there's still loyalty to John. So you have this little pocket that emerges on the fringes of Christianity associated with him. And Apollos is apparently one of those people. So when Apollos shows up in Ephesus and starts just kicking butt by being smart, competent, and charismatic, and everybody likes him, this is actually kind of a freaky moment in the history of the church. Because if this guy is arrogant and he is going to pound the table over this John the Baptist thing, he could convince a ton of people in one of the most important towns in the world to think of Jesus all wrong and lead this thing off a cliff. So when Priscilla and Aquila hear him talk, and they look him up, and they're like, hey, buddy, cool, we have a lot in common. Could we grab a meal and talk about it more? And Apollos responds with, yeah. And then Apollos apparently is receptive to learning the way of God more adequately. This is like a huge exhale moment for Christianity because, well, the people of Paul and Apollos got together, and rather than fighting, they worked the thing out. Apollos goes on to Corinth, where Paul had just been, with the blessing of Priscilla and Aquila. Now, what's kind of cool about that is that we see that he had some pretty significant success, because in 1 Corinthians 3, there was a schism in Corinth. And some people there, several years down the road are like, hey, we like Apollos. And other people are like, hey, we like Paul. And Paul is very conciliatory in the same thing, saying, what after all is Apollos? What is Paul? Only servants, through whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. So we see in Paul's later letter to his, one of his home churches in Corinth, that he really is at peace with this Apollos guy, and that rather than the two of them getting into a giant fight, they avert calamity and work together to do better stuff than they could have done on their own. Observation number 1. Teamwork is important. That's it. Last thought, I have got something coming up that I'm really excited about. My friend Destin Sandlin from Smarter Every Day and I are about to launch a new podcast called No Dumb Questions. We've got the first episode recorded and Tina is editing it. I think it's good. So that should be available really quick here. You can find it wherever podcast things happen. It'll be on all the places with the things. You know what you're doing. So again, it's No Dumb Questions. Should be out really soon. I'm pumped about it. Okay, that's plenty. I'm Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour. Thanks for hanging out. See you soon.